So since you're all communications professionals, it's so nice to be able to skip over some of the, let me say the obvious thing I'm going to skip over, and that is that story matters. When we're trying to communicate our ideas, the format of a story is very important. It's part of how people remember how the human brain is wired. Now, one of the things when you work for an advocacy group and you're presenting a story is how do you make that not a cardboard story? Because in fact, we're all beginning from an idea or something we're trying to accomplish with our story. And you know the danger of that is just cardboard. I call it the Estra syndrome because when I was 17 years old and taking creative writing in high school, I went to the library and I found the name that meant loneliness. And I named my character that. I can't remember anything about the story except at the end, she's in a wash basin and there are all these ants and she washes them down the drain. So this was not a story, this was not a character, this was like teenage angst, masquerading as a story. So advocacy groups, when they tell stories, have to be careful that they're real stories, that they're not just cardboard stories. And when I was at Human Rights Watch, I worked with a lot of lawyers. I don't know how many of you have this experience, but there is kind of that culture clash of the lawyer and the journalist. And we had researchers all over the world working in 90 countries, and they were doing nothing but hearing people's stories. They were interviewing victims of human rights abuse and hearing their stories. But they would come back without a story. And what I mean is this. They were trained as lawyers to get 50 examples of people who've been subjected to torture because that was evidentiary proof. And what they were looking for was proof. They were trying to make a case. And then they would come to me and it would be time to make the video about this issue. And I would say, okay, but we need one story. I need to know, what was she cooking for breakfast when agents of the state burst into their home and dragged away her husband? I need to know the story. And they didn't have that. They hadn't collected that kind of information. So what I really want to talk about today is maybe something a little more controversial. And that is the need actually to incorporate into your story other points of view. Okay. Hello from the other side. What is the other side's view? This does not come naturally to us. So let me first make the practical argument. When Human Rights Watch released a report about the movement system in Uganda, because the one-party state, essentially, one of the things we did was to give journalists literally the name and the phone number of the bureaucrat in the Interior Ministry whose job it was to enforce the movement system. That guy, I don't know how many phone calls he got from foreign correspondents. Maybe it wasn't that many, but if you're a mid-level bureaucrat in the Ministry of the Interior in Uganda and the BBC and CNN and the New York Times and Le Monde call you one day, that's a red letter day. You're going to go home to your wife and say, holy moly, right? So it was a way of putting pressure, and it was actually a form of advocacy. So there can be a practical reason to kind of incorporate the other side and give journalists access to the other side. You're giving them, you're leading them in a way that's going to help your advocacy. It's also, though, I think part of, and this was the argument that I made again and again at Human Rights Watch, using the memes and the tropes and the styles of journalism to shape the way you do your communications, because that's how people really are accustomed to absorbing information and how they best absorb it. So this little light bulb went on in my head, I think it was around 2004. It was just when the Darfur crisis was really heating up. And we had taken a camera crew from ABC News into Darfur so they could see what was happening with our researchers. So it came time, the annual fundraising dinner for Human Rights Watch. And we had put together a film about all the awesome work we had done. This is like the most engaging, user-friendly kind of, supposed to be, the best communications piece that we did every year. And in this film, we had embedded a little clip from ABC World News Tonight to show that Human Rights Watch had brought this story to a big audience, and that was part of our success of the year. And it was such an interesting moment. In this, what I thought, very engaging video, you heard suddenly the the world news tonight, and you're like, day, 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 day. And then this is Peter Jennings bringing you tonight deep into Darfur. You know. And in the ballroom, you couldn't have heard a pin drop. It was Pavlovian. You could feel everybody like sitting up in their seats a little taller. They were just listening differently. They like a bell, the music had triggered a thing in their brain that told them, this is journalism, this is how you receive information. And they were listening in a different way. So using those styles and those formats of journalism is part of how we reach people better. They're accustomed to receiving information that way, and we can use those tricks. I think another reason, though, to incorporate the other side is that it's a form of trust in your audience. So I think of something like This American Life, which, ooh, ding, 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 ding. There's a Pavlovian, everybody reaches for their phone. This American Life, I assume you all have heard it or listened to it. I don't listen to it all the time, but when I do, I'm always impressed at how the journalist is taking you on a kind of a journey. You know, they're finding things out and you're going along with them and they're talking to different people as they discover something. But, you know, often at the end of the day or at the end of the piece, you've arrived with them at an idea and they're leading you through this understanding. And I think, look, we're all advocates who came to our business because we looked at the world and understood what was important. We ourselves went through a process of sifting through a wide range of facts in our world and deciding what team we belong to. And part of what we need to do for our audience is help them take that journey. And that means trusting them enough to look again at all of the facts of the situation and reach the same conclusion that we do. If you really do believe in your case, then you should believe in your audience's ability to follow that too. Now I work for the Marshall Project, and it's a nonprofit media organization. We're a newsroom with journalists who go out there and report stories. So I like to say that if you think of advocacy and journalism as separated by a river, when I was at Human Rights Watch, I was on the advocacy side of the river, but I was like climbed out as far on the rocks towards journalism as I could possibly get, making journalistic pieces. Now I'm on the journalism side of the river, but we're crawled out kind of as far as we can get towards advocacy and still have integrity as journalists. So what that means is we care about criminal justice reform. We're for criminal justice reform, but we don't advocate for specific criminal justice reforms. We're not trying to tell you that House Bill 7982 should get passed. So we're not advocates. And that's very important because it gives us access to the front page of the New York Times. We co-publish all of our stories, or almost all of them, with mainstream or legacy media, New York Times, Washington Post, NPR. If we were advocates, we wouldn't be able to publish with those kinds of media organizations. So that the integrity of being journalists is very important. We have collaborated with This American Life. We have done a story with This American Life, and it was a fascinating experience. We're the youngest news organization ever to win the Pulitzer Prize. Just had to say that. And I know, it was announced, by the way, I started my job 1 year and 1 day ago. And the Pulitzers were announced a couple of weeks after I arrived, and I was like, oh, thank you so much. That's so nice of the staff of the Marshall Project to do that for me. I really, and the story for which we won the Pulitzer it's an amazing tale. It's about a woman who was sexually assaulted in Washington State. And she went to the police, she went to her family, she'd had a couple of foster mothers, but she was very close to them. She had a very loving relationship with these two different mothers. She goes to her family, she goes to the police, she tells the story. They're like, oh my God, that's terrible, blah, blah, blah. And then they begin to doubt her because essentially, I mean, read the story, but essentially because she's not exhibiting the typical behaviors that you would expect from a woman who's been raped. She's not weeping, she's not hysterical, she's not crying. And they're like, oh, there's something wrong with this story. Meanwhile, the rapist goes on to rape many other women. The police lose interest in the case. In fact, they charge her with making a false allegation. Yeah, it's incredible. And then the police in Colorado catch the rapist, and the whole story is kind of put together. So I do commend this story to you. By the way, it's 13,000 words long, And more, I know, that's mad long, right? I mean, a usual news story is like 800 or 1,000. But 1.5 million people have read it. Yeah, it gives you hope, right? Oh, there's hope for long-form journalism. People actually do still care about stories. And then millions of people, of course, listen to it on This American Life. But the reason that I found it amazing as a former journalist, I was a foreign correspondent for Newsweek for 12 years before I came to Human Rights Watch. Newsweek is super formulaic. Well, it's bankrupt actually now, I think, but it used to be a thing. It really was a thing, you know. Your first paragraph, you know, tells a little anecdotal story, and then you have the nut graph. I know a lot of you are in journalism communications. You're very familiar with this. You know, the nut graph where you step back and say, nationwide, 32% of women, right? The story that we wrote that won the Pulitzer and that we partnered with This American Life on has no nut graph. It's 13,000 words and it never tells you what to think. It's just the narrative. And you know, there's no way that you read that story and you don't get to the end and say, Jesus Christ, police have got to change the way they think about women reporting sexual assault. You absolutely come to that conclusion, and the story never tells you to. And that story is being used in police training academies, and it's being used, you know, in hospitals or, you know, first responders to sexual assault. It's having an advocacy impact, but it doesn't tell you what to think because it trusts the reader. The other moving thing about that story to me is that it's a super contentious, you know, these are lawsuits, right? This is crime. This is where violence happens and people's ideas about what happened radically differ from each other, and the police are humiliated and the woman has experienced trauma, and there's a lot that a journalist could get wrong there. But this particular story, nobody in that piece feels wronged. Everybody in the piece thought that it was fair to them. I can't tell you how hard that is. You know, I've been a journalist. That's just so hard. But it's because it's respectful. It treats everybody in the story as a human being. Some of them made horrible, unforgivable mistakes, but they are still human beings. And if I could veer into politics for a second as I close and make one final point, it's that we're living in a time of an embittered standoff in which people are shrieking at each other and not listening and not granting to each other any kind of fundamental humanity. And when the other side does that to you, it doesn't feel good and you feel compelled not to do it to them. Let's not fall into that trap. Let's not be disdainful and intolerant liberals. Let's give the other side their due. And when we tell our stories, let's acknowledge that there may be another point of view. I really believe firmly that this doesn't make your story weaker. It'll make your story stronger. Thank you.